Thank you, everybody, for being here. I am very happy to be here. I was just at the last few minutes of your last talk, and it seems that everybody is very engaged, so that's great. So I am going to be talking about reprogenetic technologies. Just a little bit about me. I'm a professor of medical ethics. I work in reproductive issues. I have been doing so for a long time. And this is an introductory talk on ethical issues related to reprogenetic technologies. Please feel free to ask questions while I'm talking. Again, it would be great if this can be a conversation. Some of you might already know some of the things that I will be discussing. I know that you had a talk on screening, prenatal screening. So I don't know exactly what the lecture discussed, but perhaps touched on some of the things that we will be discussing here. So without further ado, this is what I am going to be doing. An overview of reprogenetic technologies that are actually the combination of reproductive technologies and genetic technologies. So it's this combination that we call reprogenetic technologies. Then just discuss a little bit about arguments for and against the use of these technologies and some specific issues that are relevant, particularly to some reprogenetic technologies. Okay? Okay, so this is some images that I'm sure you have seen many times that represent some of these technologies that we are going to be discussing. So just some information so that you can put in context, the relevance of these technologies. About 8 million babies have already been born with the help of these technologies. Around nearly 2.5 million cycles are estimated each year. And, as you can see, there are about 500,000 babies are born each year through these technologies. In many countries, the number of cycles that have been performed have increased significantly in the last couple of decades, though they seem to be stabilizing now. But they have increased significantly. Some European countries, for example, you have some there, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, more than 4% of all the babies, in some cases up to 8% of all the babies are actually born through IVF. And in the United States, 1.5 of all infants are actually conceived with the help of these technologies. Just a little bit more, Europe actually leads the world on, in the use of reproductive technologies with about 50% of all the cycles performed. These are the most active countries in Europe: France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and Spain, together with the UK. And the most active countries overall are actually Japan and the USA. So again, these technologies are used significantly all over the world, obviously in some countries more than in others, but they are clinical technologies that are used routinely in many cases with a significant amount of babies actually born with the help of these technologies. Okay, so these are the technologies that we are going to be discussing. IVF, in vitro fertilization, which is the basic technology. So this is a reproductive technology that has been used since 1972, so for many decades. Any other of the technologies that we're going to be discussing presupposes the use of IVF, okay? So it's the basic technology. Some of the ways in which IVF can be used is with fresh eggs and sperm and embryos, or with cryopreserved gametes or embryos, okay? So that's one of the advances of these technologies, the ability to freeze embryos or sperm or oocytes and use them later. PGD, preimplantation genetic diagnosis or screening, which is the genetic technology that is often used in combination with IVF. And then we will talk a little bit about some of the newest germline modifications that allow new technologies that allow actually the modification of the DNA of embryos. So just again, quickly, some overview of what these technologies are. This in vitro fertilization is actually a process that allows for the fertilization of the oocyte by sperm that has been prepared properly outside of the body. This technology is the first technology that allows the creation of embryos outside of a woman's body. Okay, so this was, of course, a breakthrough when the technology was first used. The process is complex, and this is a summary of what it involves. Women receive, in the majority of the cases, they would receive hormones that would allow them to actually produce more oocytes than what they are normally produced. Those oocytes would be then extracted from the woman. And after the sperm has been prepared, they would be placed with the sperm so that embryos can be produced. Okay, so at this point, you have the embryo. The embryo then will be transferred again to the woman's body with the hope of a pregnancy. It's again a complex process. Is the success rates of IVF, the average success rate is about 25%. So as you can imagine, many of these cycles actually fail. Until about a decade ago, the preparation of the sperm was again thousands of sperms would be put together so that fertilization could occur. But this new technology, ICSI, actually allows, as you can see in that image, for the introduction into the oocyte of one sperm. This was initially developed to help men who had low sperm count, but is now used actually quite commonly, even in cases where that's not a problem. There is some evidence that indicates that this might be more effective, but again, the evidence is still challenged. Nonetheless, it's quite common, the use of this technology now. So these technologies, IVF, involve some risks, risks to women, obviously, risks that are related to the hormones that they have to take. One of the consequences might be hyperstimulation of the ovaries. Many of these interventions give rise to multiple births because more than one embryo is transferred. And this can have obviously effects on women's status. So the risks are not just to their health, but to how women are seen, whether women continue to be identified as primarily mothers, and how this might affect actually women's ability to do other things. There are also some risks to the babies, those that are related to multiple births, children who are born, twins or triplets, have a much lower birth weight, and a variety of health problems that result from that multiple pregnancy. The evidence about the health of people born through IVF is still complex. There are not many long-term studies. The ones that exist are conflicting. In most cases, the studies suggest that there are no significant differences between baby born through these technologies and born, without technological help. And some other studies suggest that there might be some increased risk to the health of these babies. Again, difficult to assess at this time. Whatever those risks are, they don't seem to be much higher than the risks of a birth without technological help. So those are, again, IVF basic reproductive technology, okay? So in 1992, this new technology, preimplantation genetic diagnosis, was developed. And what this technology does is once the embryo has been created, you can take one cell or a couple of cells of the embryo, as you can see there, and then assess the chromosomal content and the DNA, the genomic content of the cell. That allows clinicians to determine whether there might be some problem that results from some genetic abnormality or mutation, okay? So it's a common procedure today. Many clinics use PGD as part of the in vitro fertilization process. Depending on who the couple might be, if the couple are actually people who are known to be at risk of transmitting certain genetic diseases, PGD will be used to ensure that the embryos that are going to be transferred to the woman's body do not have that genetic abnormality or mutation, okay? So again, a common technology now used in combination with IVF. PGD, again, is now the kinds of technologies that we have to analyze the genome allow us to have an incredible amount of information. Much of that information at this point might not be clear. We might not know the consequences of some of the variations in the genome. But the thing is that that information can now be available to clinicians and certainly to prospective parents. What the consequences of this might be for the clinic is still unclear. As I was mentioning, some of these techniques can provide information on hundreds of mutations and variants, many of which, again, we don't know the effects. So what are some of the risks of using PGD independently of IVF? So in addition to IVF, there might be risks of misdiagnosis. So, you might think that a particular embryo has a genetic mutation, turns out that they don't, or that it doesn't, but it turns that it does. There is actually some evidence that depending of the stage at which the cells are taken, you might be able to minimize these risks of misdiagnosis. Embryos can be damaged, and if they are, obviously this would result in a destroyed embryo and in a decrease of the rates of transfer, so lower rates of pregnancy. The initial evidence about this technology is that babies born through it, with the help of this technology, have normal neurodevelopment that is comparable with babies born without the help of technologies. But as in the case of IVF, and in this case even more because it's a younger technology, we don't have enough long-term health outcome studies to assess the evidence of the consequences of the use of this technology on babies' health. So the last technology that I want to discuss is this genetic engineering technologies. It's the set of these technologies. Some of those technologies might be used to modify somatic cells, so can be used in adults. We use them. CRISPR, for example, some of these gene editing technologies are being used now in clinical trials to address a variety of diseases, from HIV to some ocular problems. But the ones that concerns us are the germline modifications, so modifications that happen at the stage, at the embryonic stage, or in some cases, the gamete stage, so where you modify the gametes before they create the embryos. They have been used in two different kinds of ways. One is these mitochondrial transfer technologies that are only a handful of children have been born through this technology. And in the UK, there are clinical trials underway. We don't have the results yet of those clinical trials. In the US, this technology has yet to be approved by the FDA, although the Academy of Science has said that it is ethically appropriate, with certain conditions for this technology to be used in clinical trials. The other technology that has been used with a huge scandal is CRISPR. CRISPR-Cas9 is the complete name of the technology. This is a tool that allows researchers to modify the genome of embryos or cells in general, it has been used in spite of the fact that most countries do not approve the use of germline modifications. It has been used, and there are 2 babies who have been born in China through the use of this technology. We don't know much about. We know that the babies were born healthy. We don't know any more about the babies or what their health status is at this point. Okay, so those are the technologies that, again, are available. A basic distinction between reprogenetic technologies and reprogenetic technologies is that the first one, reproductive technologies, allow people to have children, people who might otherwise not be able to have them, okay? That's the goal of these technologies, is to help people to have biologically related children, at least related to one of them in most cases. Reprogenetic technologies, however, do not simply aim to allow people to have children, but to have particular kinds of children. That means normally children without particular kinds of diseases or disabilities. So in most cases, again, these technologies are used to eliminate embryos that might have mutations that we know might produce disease or disabilities. But of course, these technologies can be used to select for particular traits, for example, sex, and we know that they are used in that way, actually, or for other characteristics, so to modify particular genes so that the person might have an increased protection. So that was the case, for example, with the use of CRISPR in the Chinese case, where the babies actually, the genome of the babies was modified so that presumably they would have less chance of being infected by HIV. So technologies, again, reproductive technologies, people can have children. Reprogenetic technologies, they can have particular kinds of children, okay? Again, in most cases, children without diseases or disabilities, but that's a huge difference between these the aims of these two sets of technologies, even when, again, the basic technology in both cases is this in vitro fertilization. So before I go into the ethical issues, any questions about the technologies? No questions?
Nope.
Okay, so let me then go with the ethical issues that these technologies raise. So as you can imagine, the ethical concerns that they raise are complex for a variety of reasons. So they involve an activity that many human beings think is essential to their well-being, you know, the ability to reproduce. So reproduction is, in most cases, for most people, very tied to our humanity and our well-being. So anything that has to do with reproduction is going to actually raise significant ethical challenges. So that's one reason. Involve very powerful technologies, particularly the new technologies that allow us to modify the genome in ways that at this point, you know, we can only imagine. So significant power and lots of uncertainty about what the consequences of those changes might be. It involves medicine and the practice of medicine. You know, it involves questions about whether this is an appropriate role for medicine to be doing this, what else medicine could be doing to help people to have children, what else could medicine be doing to actually help reduce disease and disability. So all of these are part of the discussion, of the debate with these technologies. And of course, it involves a variety of stakeholders that might have conflicting interests. So who might be some of those stakeholders? Anyone? Who are the people who might have interests in the outcomes of these technologies?
Well, you've got the intended parents.
Correct. The intended parents, certainly they are interested stakeholders with these technologies.
The donor.
Donors, that's correct, given that in many cases we use sperm and egg donors, sometimes embryo donors. So those persons are also stakeholders with significant interest in these technologies. Who else?
The medical community, the healthcare provider.
Healthcare providers, that's correct. They are also people who have a stake on how these technologies are used, whether they are used at all, and if so, how they are used. Anyone else?
Disability advocacy groups.
That's correct. There may be many groups who obviously have important stakes, given that these technologies are often used to prevent the birth of people without certain disabilities. The disability community is actually one of the communities that have been more critical of the use of these technologies. Anyone else?
The companies who are producing the technology.
That's certainly the case. So this is obviously, these technologies involve an industry. And of course, you know, those behind the industry also have significant interest in the use of these technologies. And of course, society as a whole, given that the use of these technologies can change society in significant ways. Some of them actually unknown at this point, and therefore we all have a stake also on these technologies. So we have here some of the things that we just mentioned. Clinicians, societies are all stakeholders in this, in the use of these technologies. So what are some arguments that can be provided for the use of these technologies. What arguments do we have, you know, to argue that the technologies are actually appropriately used? There are several arguments. So, so one is that these technologies actually increase the reproductive options of people who wouldn't be able to have children, genetically related children otherwise. They now have this option. People who couldn't produce embryos or sperm now have an option because they are allowed to still carry children. And of course, people who have some genetic diseases that might be inheritable, they now have the option of using these technologies to avoid the possibility of that transmission. So increases reproductive options. In general, we tend to believe that technologies that increase our options are good things to have. We like options in general. They promote parental autonomy, you know, for some of the same reasons. They allow parents to determine whether they want certain kinds of children to be born or not. So this is consistent with many other liberties that we allow parents to have, you know, about how to bring up their kids, how many they have, when they have them. All of them, those are consistent with parental autonomy. They prevent diseases and disabilities in some sense of preventing. Again, in the germline case, it is the case that they can prevent diseases and disabilities in the somatic case, you know, the modifications. In the case of germline or selection of embryos, what they prevent really is not the disease and the disability, is the birth of people who might have diseases and disabilities, okay? And this is an important difference, you know, for many of the ethical issues that these technologies raise. Some people say that these technologies can allow us to improve the human species, particularly the new technologies, you know, that allow us to edit the human genome and improve in what, you know, what nature has provided. We can become better at better memory, better, you know, stronger, whatever, you know, characteristics we think that are good for human beings to have, you know, these technologies presumably would allow us to do so. And ultimately, they can improve society if they are able to do all of these things. So these are some of the arguments that have been provided to promote the use of these technologies. We can discuss, you know, the different arguments and see what problems there might be with each of them. I'm going to first provide the arguments that have been provided against the use of these technologies, and then we can discuss them. So some arguments against have been deontological arguments. Some people have argued that these technologies commodify women, commodify children, commodify reproduction. They make these entities into objects that can be sold and bought, exchanged, and that these might obviously have implications for, you know, clearly for society, but also for women and children. Some people have argued that these technologies treat children merely as means to their parents' ends. Particularly, again, this is in the case of reprogenetic technologies, because those technologies allow for parents' wishes to actually take control of the babies who are born. So if I want a child with a particular characteristic, a child who is male or a female, then the argument goes, what we do is actually treat those children as means to the desires of their parents. And some people have argued that these technologies actually present a threat to our self-understanding, the kinds of entities that we are as human beings. So this argument takes the chance of being born, whomever it might be, as something essential to our identity, our sense of freedom. We are not chosen, we are not controlled in how we are born. But these technologies actually allow us to do exactly that, control, to some degree at least, a significant degree, who is being born and what characteristics those people might have. And that, again, might affect our self-understanding. Some other arguments are consequentialist arguments, so they focus on the consequences of these technologies. So some of them are questions about safety for the women and the children who are born through this technology, either physical, because of the risks involved, or psychological, because of the consequences that these technologies might have for, the status, as I was mentioning before, of women, or for how we consider children. But also risks to society, a devaluation of women because of this commodification, for example, or of children because they are thought to be interchangeable, increase inequality because these technologies obviously are very expensive. Only some people will be able to use them. Only some people are able to use them. And given that these technologies allow for the improving in some way or the elimination of some diseases and disabilities, this obviously is likely to increase inequalities. And it can also change the ways in which we think of parents, the ways in which we think a parent is a good parent, from thinking that parents ought to just accept and love any child who comes along. These technologies actually might require that we have children who are most likely to have a best chance at a better life, so that good parents would be those who select the best children rather than those who simply love any children who comes along, okay? So all of these are arguments that have been presented against the use of these technologies. Now, neither the arguments for nor the arguments against need to be arguments that actually reject the use. They are only, they might be thought of as arguments that we need to consider to ensure that if we're going to use these technologies, we try to minimize the harms that they might actually involve. So we put into place the necessary mechanisms, social, political, financial, that might be necessary for these harms actually not to develop. Okay, obviously, this is the slippery slope. We start with using these technologies to eliminate diseases and disabilities, and we end with these technologies being used to create, superhumans. That's another consequence of these technologies that some people fear. Okay, so before going into the specific issues, now that you have an overview of these technologies and of the possible arguments for and against these technologies, what's your thought? What are your views on this?
Hi, thank you for the presentation so far. I think that like the point you raised about there being increased inequality definitely makes sense, especially if there's unequal access to the reprogenetic technologies. But at the same time, I think it could also reduce inequality in some respects, especially with people who have like conditions that might limit their abilities. With this, there wouldn't be that wouldn't be as much of a factor. So I think that can also be considered. But I think also there needs to be a line drawn between these technologies being used for medical purposes versus purposes of just trying to make the optimal human. I think those are a little bit different. So I think that if we can like separate those, then they can be treated differently in these discussions.
Right. So yeah, some people have argued that we should try to make distinctions between the use of these technologies for medical purpose and the use of these technologies for enhancement purposes. So to make things better. But it's not that distinction is more difficult than it appears. So many things that we might think of as medical issues are only medical issues in the sense that they are used in medicine, but they do not prevent people from having normal and good lives. So that's one issue. The other is that what we consider enhancement today might not be thought to be an enhancement, in a decade when everybody actually has the ability of, having, better memory. So if everybody who is using these technologies are are trying to get their children to have better memory, then in a decade, having better memory wouldn't be an enhancement, it would be just the normal thing. So that's one of the concerns with these technologies. It's very difficult to separate these things. And that's the fear with the slippery slope. We start with, the red line, only things that are, in fact, when these technologies began to be used, the argument was we can only use them to eliminate very serious diseases and disabilities. Very serious diseases and disabilities that actually reduce in significant ways because of the pain that they cause, because the difficulties that they create, the well-being of people who have those diseases. We use them now for just the risk of increased risk of disease, not because you're going to have a disease, just because you are going to be an increased risk of disease. So it's very difficult to maintain that line, even if we were to want to do so. Many people think that we shouldn't. And your other point about inequality, indeed, again, most people agree that these technologies, because they are used in a context that is, a context that involves racism, sexism, ableism. So we have that context. In that context, it's unlikely that these technologies are going to, improve those things because the kinds of values that we have are values that are likely to promote those values of racism and sexism and ableism. But it's true that the technologies could be used in ways that actually could reduce those injustices, insofar as some diseases and disabilities create a stigmatization, for example. Then if we eliminate the diseases or the disabilities, then, we might reduce or we improve them somehow, then, there would be less stigma. That's a challenging argument. And again, as I was mentioning before, the disability community has significant objections to these technologies because a significant argument is that many of the problems that disabilities produce are not the result of the disability itself, but of the conditions, the social conditions under which people with disabilities have to live. If that's the case, then the stigma is unlikely to disappear simply because fewer people who suffer these disabilities. It might actually be that because there are fewer people, more people, the stigma would be greater. But those are, again, challenging issues indeed about these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I found that was really interesting, and I hadn't even thought about that in that sort of context before. I have another slightly different question, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I just want, when you do the germline genetic alterations, you're interfering with natural selection, and does this sort of hinder natural variation and restrict the gene pool, and what sort of adverse effects does this have on the human race, if this were to become commonplace? Does this make us more susceptible to disease and less able to adapt?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. It's a question about which we don't have an answer because, of course, these technologies haven't been used yet. It is a risk, and there are two possible answers to that concern. So there are some people who think, yes, this is going to interfere with natural selection, and all the better for human beings. Natural selection has been a disaster. They have created human beings which are not particularly good entities. So that's the argument, for example, of people like John Harris, who think that natural reproduction is a complete disaster, and if we can improve on it, that's what we ought to do. So much so that he thinks actually that we have a moral obligation to use these technologies. Not that it's only permissible, but that we have a moral obligation. So people who are a little more concerned with the consequences for the human species, they might argue in two different ways. One is, before we use these technologies in a routine way, let's make sure that we do sufficient studies to determine what might be the consequences. Of course, this is a difficult, argument to make, because natural selection works, not in just one generation, but many, many generations. So who knows what the possible consequences of changing the genome might be. But some of them might indeed be that if we select particular kinds of mutations or against particular kinds of mutations, we might actually be selecting against mutations that where our environments to change would allow us to adapt. That is a serious concern, and it's unlikely that we are going to be able to have sufficient information to be able to address that concern. The other response that people might give is that if we use these technologies in ways that do not radically change our genome, then we minimize the risks on the human species. All of this, again, is quite uncertain. We don't have enough information, which is obviously one reason to consider whether these technologies should be used, particular gene editing technologies, before we have, more information on them. But we are never going to have, information to be able to address that particular issue, which is a serious one.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I just have one more thing to ask.
Sure.
When you say radically change, and that sort of line of argument where even sort of selecting against Down syndrome or trisomy 21, that's sort of more common, but even still something like that, without proper information, without any ability to test on future generations and the fact of natural selection, can we really say that any editing or any selection is not radical?
We can't actually, we cannot, but so this is that leads us to the following problem. So we introduce technologies in society all the time without having all the information that we might want about, the possible consequences. So if we don't do so, obviously we wouldn't have the kinds of technological advances that we have, many of which, of course, have been very good for human beings. So when we have new technologies, we always have this question about how safe is safe enough, or how much risk can we tolerate, or how much uncertainty can we tolerate. And some things, like what do we think might be the worst that can happen if we eliminate, a disability that many people think is very bad. We might think, well, we think that we can live with that uncertainty or that risk. if the issue is, let's make sure that we introduce particular genome changes in the genome, then people might say, well, no, we don't need that. That is too risky for the potential benefits of that technology. So this is an assessment of risk and benefits. And of course, different people are going to have different conceptions of how safe it is safe and how risky it is, too risky. But your point is well taken. I think, again, one of the problems with these technologies has been that we have been insufficiently attentive to some of the questions that related to this issue of how might the change in our genome affect future generations. At this point, however, one of the reasons that most people would use to be not very concerned with this is that although the technologies are being used in significant amounts, they are not being used in such great amounts as to actually produce a problem for the human species. So there are still not enough people who are, being born through these ways, or certainly there is no people who have been modified so that it would create a problem at this point for the human species.
Yeah, I suppose that's why we need to look at the people who are being modified now, so that once it is more widespread, we have that information. Yeah.
Correct. That's the importance of long-term studies. That's correct. Yes. More questions?
I just have a comment.
Yes, please.
I just wondered, when we talk about CRISPR technologies, whether or not we're approaching an era where we need to have something like a set of ethical hazard levels of some kind to gauge the motivation behind the usage. It could be motivated by profit for the technology itself, and also the burden on the health system could be a motivation for using. It could be, choosing, based on, race or any of those issues as well. So I just wondered, that was just a thought I had.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to ascertain people's motivations. It would be very difficult to use it as a criterion for who can use these technologies. People can lie. So we do know that these technologies can be used and are likely to be used, not intentionally. So this is a problem of collective action. So individuals might be choosing a particular trait simply because they think it's better for their children. So, we do this all the time with our, children born through no technological aid. Okay, so we think that it is better for our children to send them to good schools, for them to play the piano, whatever the values that we have, we are going to try to get our children to have better lives and improve their well-being, okay? So these technologies allow us to do some of the same. So, if you have more money, and your children get sick, you're going to take the child to a better hospital. So these technologies allows you to do, again, in a social context of injustice, as the one we have, allows some people to use the technologies in ways that are similar to the ways that we use many other means that we have to improve people's well-being or our children's well-being. So I don't think that there are many people who think that these technologies are likely to make things better in that sense. Better, that the racism and sexism and all of those things are going to disappear thanks to these technologies. I mean, even supporters of these technologies recognize that this is a problem. Their argument is, well, in that case, we need to put in place mechanisms that minimize those risks. So we need to change, social structures that make more likely that people are going to choose particular kinds of traits. So this has been evident with the ability to select for sex, which we are able to do. And in societies where the birth of a male is significantly more valuable than the birth of a girl, these technologies are being used to choose males with, particular kinds of consequences, obviously, for societies. So what these supporters of these technologies say is, well, rather than banning the technology, what we need to do is change people's conceptions of, the kind, how we value our children. And we should change social structures rather than prevent people from having the children that they want to have. Of course, people are unlikely to want to have boys if they don't live in a context in which, being a boy is actually an advantage. But, we can put that aside. Or a female, whatever it might be the particular issue. So although I agree with you that, it would be good to have some criteria for when it is appropriate to use these technologies, it is very difficult to do so.
Thank you.
Sure. More questions? Okay, so let me then go. I know that if you're writing on the thing, please speak it, because I can't read it. I cannot do if someone can read them to me, that would be great. But if you can just ask the question, that would be fantastic, so that we can have the discussion. So any other questions?
Akari, did you want to voice your question, or would you like me to read it for you?
Yeah, it was just more of an observation than a question, but sure. I just noticed that the topic relates back to three identical strangers, because they're talking about the possibility that the research could have been about nature versus nurture. And so yeah, I could read my comment out loud. I feel like the topic of enhancing children ties back to the ending of Three Identical Strangers. Quote, nurture can overcome nature. And though overcoming nature portrays nature negatively, like how some view natural selection negatively, there's also an emphasis on nurture and addressing social issues, such as societal perceptions of children in terms of reprogenetics.
Yes, that's exactly, yes, that's a very good point. In these technologies, bring to the fore this issue about the importance of genetics and the environment. I am usually skeptical of the separation between environment and nature, biological nature. Particularly when we talk about human beings, there are no human beings that are just biological entities. Human beings are always in a social context. We do not have human beings who appear, somewhere outside the social context. So there is no way to actually separate these two realms, the biological one and the environmental one. And that fact is a significant one when we talk about these technologies, because it's not only that, obviously, if we want to address disabilities, we have different means of doing so. We can address disabilities by curing the disability, doing some medical procedures, or preventing people with disabilities from being born. or we can change the conditions under which disability is actually a significant problem. So we have alternatives, and what alternatives we choose obviously says something about the kinds of societies that we want to build, or the kinds of societies that we do actually have. So, but indeed, this is, you know, an issue that calls attention to this combination of biology and environment. Okay, let me just go with, you know, a little bit about these special issues, again, that we have actually mentioned. One has to do with how much power should prospective parents have over their children. So this is one of the most significant questions with these technologies, given that they allow lots of power. So it's also a question about whether parents are not just permitted from using these technologies. I mentioned that some people actually say that we have a moral obligation to use these technologies. And then also what are the moral obligations of clinicians who are using these technologies. So just some examples, you know, so this issue about the power of prospective parents. So some people say that these technologies are okay if they are used to select against disability. But of course, we might ask, why is that okay? And so, you know, some of the discussion that we had just had, you know, about there are many ways to address disability. You know, why should we choose eliminating people with disabilities rather than changing the conditions that make disability, you know, something that affects well-being in serious ways. So that's a serious problem. And what disabilities? So against what disabilities are we going to think that it is okay for parents to have control? So as I mentioned before, these technologies were initially said, we are only doing it against very serious diseases and very serious disabilities, and now they can be used for, you know, what many might argue are indeed not serious at all. So that's one issue. What if we use these technologies to actually cause disabled children to exist? So, you know, people think that these technologies are good because if they allow increased reproductive options. Some people, this has been, you know, particularly voiced in the context of the deaf community, where deaf parents, parents who might be deaf because of genetic reasons, might want to reproduce, and they want to reproduce, they want to have children who are going to be deaf. So they might use these technologies actually to ensure that the children are actually going to be deaf. Now, as you can imagine, the overwhelming majority of people oppose the use of these technologies for that reason, even when the main argument for these technologies is that they allow parents to make choices about, you know, the children who they want to have. We have, again, the same issue about why not? Why not? There are certain assumptions about disabilities that obviously would lead someone to say we should not use these technologies to create people with disabilities. And of course, we will have the issue of what disabilities would we be allowed to bring into the world or not. As we mentioned before, these technologies can be used to select for or against non-disease traits, you know, like memory, strength, whatever it might be. Again, how tall someone is. This is just not about diseases and disabilities that some might think it's okay, you know, to use these technologies, but about traits like sex, for example, which of course have nothing to do with, you know, being a female or a male. It's not a disease. In that case, you know, should parents be allowed, given that in many cases, right now have the option to do so, and in the future they might have even increased options to do so. And there is this question about whether parents are morally required. If we can improve the chances that children would be born without diseases and disabilities, should people have a moral obligation to use these technologies? As I mentioned before, you know, people like Savulescu and Harris actually do argue that we do have a moral obligation to use them. And they argue that we have a moral obligation to use them for selection purposes, you know, to select against particular diseases and disabilities that affect well-being, but also for enhancement purposes, given that if we enhance particular kinds of traits, you know, we have more chances of having increased well-being. And then there is the issue about what moral obligations clinicians might have when using these technologies. Do they have a moral obligation to refuse if some parents are going to be choosing things that the clinician thinks are inappropriate? If so, on what grounds? Can they refuse to do that? Or are they obligated to encourage some parents who might be at risk, for example, of transmitting certain diseases of using these technologies? And if they do so, on what ethical grounds would they do so? So these are very challenging issues that arise in the context of these technologies. So these are some of the references, you know, that I mentioned throughout, of people who work on these areas and have proposed, you know, the use of these technologies. And that's it. So let me stop sharing so that I can see more people and see if there are any final questions.
Dr. de Melo-Martin, Dr. de Bropner made a comment in the chat saying the use of STEM technology combined with IVF allows gay couples to parent together as well.
That's correct. Not just STEM. Yeah, that would allow them to have genetically related children, to both of them. But yeah, one of the things that these technologies allow is actually allow homosexual couples to have children who are genetically related to at least one of them. So something that in other cases that would not have been possible. This is the case also with surrogacy, for example, which again, many gay couples are using. So indeed, to the extent that we think that having genetically related children is a very important component of well-being, these technologies are certainly useful in that regard. Of course, I think that we need to balance that ability against, you know, at least some of the concerns that we have discussed here. Any other question or comments?
Sergio, did you have a comment that you wanted to voice?
Yeah, just a quick comment about Eri's position. I was just wondering, it sounds like that empowering human beings to interfere with natural selection, if you think that human beings are not a good product of natural selection, it seems a bit counterintuitive to me, but yeah.
Yes, actually, you know, one of the works that I have done on reprogenetic technologies, this book, you know, Rethinking Reprogenetics, one of the chapters is actually presenting that argument, because the people who actually are more vocal about the use of these technologies are the people who think that human beings are a complete disaster on so many grounds. So you think, well, and to those people, you want to allow the control of natural selection? That doesn't seem very smart. Indeed, yes. Warren, I think yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a quick question. In terms of the technology, assuming that there's no regulation that's put in place to prevent the use of this sort of technology for non-disease conditions, how soon do you think that that will enter the mainstream, assuming that there's no barriers to this?
You mean how soon we would be able to develop regulations to prevent the use of the technologies in that way?
No. How soon do you think that the use of these technologies to implement non-disease modification?
Yes. Thank you. These technologies are now being used in that way for selection. So we can now select. Again, sex is one of those conditions, but we can select also against minor genetic problems. People with particular kinds of skin colors, or so we can select against minor problems for people, which, if someone were to be born with those, we wouldn't have a problem. And again, we can select for or against a particular sex, which is not a disease. Now, the question about when can we modify the genome to actually change, particular kinds of genes so that we produce stronger people or whatever it might be. Well, we hope that not anytime soon, or I do hope that not anytime soon. The technology is certainly not allowed right now in any country, any of the industrialized countries. The problem is that the technology is very easy. It's actually very easy to do this. If you have a lab and you have access to embryos, as it was proved by these two babies who were born. So the fear is that some scientists are going to use them in this way, and that the consequences of that might be that they are successful in the use of these technologies, and that is likely to make the scientific community less worried that if they are used in a way that, create problems. So, but right now, no sane person would think that we should be using these technologies in the clinic. At most, people think that we should start doing more research so that it can be eventually brought to clinical trials to see the consequences of these technologies. But, I'm sure that if someone had asked, how soon would PGD be brought into the clinic, when it was first developed, people might have thought, well, we need to do lots of studies before we bring it, and then that didn't happen. So it might be that soon enough, we might have these technologies in use. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions?
I think I'm on now.
Okay.
Just to clarify my two previous questions. My first question, what about the use of stem cell technology to convert an egg to a sperm, or vice versa, to allow gay couples to procreate? And also, would you like to comment on the ethical issues involved in cloning?
Yes. Okay. So, right. So indeed, we can now use the stem cells to produce gametes. And that would allow homosexual couples actually to have children who are related to both members of the couple, not just to one of them. Now, this is a technology that is still not in use. But researchers are actually doing research about, whether gametes produced through stem cells actually have the same characteristics as those who are naturally produced. My suspicion is that this research, will eventually lead to the possibility of indeed developing gametes from stem cells, and that they will be used in, that way, but also in other ways, for people who might not have gametes themselves for a variety of diseases, and so that would allow them to have children who are genetically related rather than using a sperm or egg donor. So that's absolutely the case. And there are a significant number of groups who are actually doing research on that at this point. And what was the second question? Sorry.
The ethical issues involved in cloning.
Oh, cloning, yes. Well, interestingly enough, you know, when cloning came about, it raised a significant amount of debate, which has died. Most researchers are not, certainly in the clinic, and in the fertility clinic, most people are not interested in the cloning because, you know, most people want to have children who are related to, you know, the two members of the couple. So although it might be possible that some people would have an interest in reproducing a child who is just like them, it doesn't seem that this would be the case for most people, and therefore it's not clear that this would be a good investment. But that said, cloning, of course, has you know, many advantages over reproduction. You know, because once you have the particular genetic makeup, if you think that it's a good genetic makeup, you don't want to add to the recombination, because then you might get something worse. So that if you have gotten something that is very good, then you might want to just keep having it. Certainly, we do this with animals. You know, this is the normal practice in breeding animals. And again, I am skeptical that this is something that human beings in general would want, but we have the abilities to do this.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I wanted to ask about, I don't know how best to ask it because I really don't have the background. But then I wanted to ask in terms of payments, how is it done? Maybe when you answer that, I'll be able to ask my question. Because like in our context, I know that these technologies are there, and we only have one clinic in the whole country that's doing that, and it's very expensive. So when you look at that, a poor person from one community cannot stand up and say, I'm not able to have children, and therefore let me go and go to a fertility clinic and have this done. So there's issues of widening the gap between the poor and the rich, and those who are able to actually stand up and make this decision to go for this technology.
Yes, yes, you are right. As I mentioned before, one of the issues is, you know, whether these technologies are going to increase inequalities, and that's not a theoretical question. We know that they already do so, because indeed these technologies are very expensive. In countries like the United States, where, you know, the use of this technology is related to either people's having, you know, unemployment that has an insurance that covers at least the costs of some cycles, people would have to pay for these technologies. They are very expensive, which means that, you know, only the number of people who can have access to these technologies is obviously not very great, and are those who have a certain socioeconomic power. In Europe, these technologies are actually covered by the national health systems. It is true that they have a significant amount of restrictions. You can only use them under certain conditions. You can only use them for a number of times. So there are constraints, but this allows at least people who might not have other financial means, to access the technologies. Still, the waiting lists tend to be very long. So, even in Europe, many people would go to private clinics to actually have access to these technologies. And in other countries where, the concerns might not be with whether I have a biologically related child, but whether my child is going to survive, then these technologies or the use of these technologies is even more challenging, who has access to them, indeed. One important thing to realize, that's the reason I said technologies are always implemented in a social context. They are not in a vacuum. And so, we cannot evaluate technologies as if they were just a tool that happens to be developed and is great. They are developed and implemented in a particular social context, and we ought to attend to how the social context is going to actually modify the use of the technology. So again, in a context of inequalities, what we are going to have is the use of these technologies in ways that are going to increase inequalities. I don't know what the solution is to that. So some people argue, well, the solution to that is to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. Pie in the sky. Of course, we have many more pressing problems in our world than, attempting to allow people to have genetically related children. People are dying because they don't have food. So it seems that between these two pressing needs, one seems, much more significant than the other. So the make it available to everybody is just not feasible. And then the issue is, okay, in which ways can you implement them so that they do not increase inequalities, even if they don't eliminate them? Not easy, not easy.